Hello. Welcome to the Sydney Writers' Festival, and welcome all of you to our session with the celebrated author, Australian author David Malouf. I'm Tegan Bennett Daylight. It's a pleasure to meet you. Before we begin, if you could please, out of love for literature, switch off your mobile phones. Thank you. And as usual, at the end of our session, there'll be 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and then David will be signing copies of his books. I'm going to ask you, if you can, to make your questions as question-like as possible. I do really understand the need to join the conversation, because I think that's why we're all here, to be in conversation with David, but just for the ease of everybody else. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. I pay respect to the elders of today and those from the past who looked after and continue to look after the stories and wisdom of this land. So it is a very great pleasure to be able to introduce you to Mr. David Malouf, whose work and life is the subject of today's session. David is the author of so many works of poetry and prose that a complete recital of them would take up too much of our precious time with him. So let me say that he was first known in Australia as a poet, with the collections Bicycle and Other Poems and Neighbours in a Thicket. His first novel, Jono, was published in 1975. Since then, David's written 8 more novels, including An Imaginary Life, Fly Away Peter, The Great World, Remembering Babylon and Ransom. His short story collections include Antipodes, Dream Stuff and Every Move You Make, while his latest volume of poetry is The Magnificent Earth Hour, published by the University of Queensland Press. David is the author of A First Place, his first collection of essays, published this year by Random House, and his now famous autobiographical reflection on Place 12 Edmondstone Street. He's written for the stage as well, and I'm not covering everything, including the libretto for Michael Barclay's Jane Eyre. He's won, among other awards, the inaugural IMPAC Dublin Literary Award, the Commonwealth Writers Prize, the Miles Franklin, the Pascal Prize for Criticism, the Neustadt International Prize for Literature, and the Prix Femina Etranger, which is a French award given each year to a non-French writer who's selected by a panel of entirely female judges. Seems to me to be a magnificent award. And David won this for The Great World in 1991. He was recently named Australian Book Review's inaugural laureate, a position that has no remuneration but allows him to bestow a laureateship worth $5,000 on a younger writer, an honour that's entirely fitting for a writer who's inevitably generous to his peers and the arts community at large, always willing to contribute to the expansion of our cultural landscape. David grew up in Brisbane, has lived in England and Italy, and we're lucky enough to say that he now lives with us in Sydney. He turned 80 on the 20th of March this year, and he has the bearing and brain of an especially astute 50-year-old. So please make him very welcome. Now, most of you will be here, as I am, long-time readers of David's, and the course that you've charted through his work will be very personal according to your own history of reading. My first Malouf book was The Great World, which I read in my 20s. I've read a great deal, but I can still remember how I felt on finishing it. I felt that I'd had to be quiet and still to read it properly, which is a hard task in your early 20s, or it was in my early 20s. I felt as though its rewards were many, if only I was able to be calm enough to receive them. And I've really never lost this sense of David's work. For me, this quietness in David's work appears most significantly in his second book, An Imaginary Life, which is indeed an imagining of Ovid's life after exile to Thomas in 8 AD. And it seems quite a departure from Jono, which is a local book. It's hardly noisy, but it is more vernacular in style. And although Jono's set in Brisbane, where you grew up, David, An Imaginary Life can feel more personal. And it feels, too, as though it contains the seeds of all that David was setting out to do. And I was quite pleased to find that Dr. Yvonne Smith, who is writing about David's work, agrees with me about this. I wonder if you could tell us about writing An Imaginary Life and about the change, if there was one, from Jono to An Imaginary Life.
Writing a second book is always something very, very difficult. I was lucky in two ways. The first way is that Jono, when it came out, probably got the worst reviews of any book, any first book in Australian history, I would have thought. So I wasn't in that position that a young writer often is, of having a huge success on my hands, and you thought, oh, now what can I do? So I didn't do anything for a while, and then I started to write a book, and I didn't say to myself it was a novel, so I didn't say I was writing my second novel. I thought it was perhaps a long prose poem. I thought it might be just a monologue, and it's something that grew absolutely out of the world of poetry, because what it was about really was the importance to a poet of language and of his life in language, and the question of what would happen to you if you were a poet and had language taken away. And the first person I had thought of that in connection with was Mandelstam, the Russian poet, and I'd written a poem about that. And then I found myself taking up that question in terms of Ovid. And of course, it just grew from there, because the whole idea of the wild child, the whole idea of that imaginary place, which I had to completely imagine, and a kind of anthropology for the people, meant that I started doing things in fiction that were much more daring and much more imaginative than I had really attempted in Jono. Because in Jono, I was writing about an actual relationship and actual experience. And I discovered in that, what every writer finds, is that once you start telling it, then you change it because you want it to be told in the most interesting way. That was a good discovery, but I still stuck very much to personal experience. I would say now, and that an imaginary life is in many ways my most personal and autobiographical book. But maybe I would be the only person who would know why.
Without asking you to reveal too much, I did read somewhere that you'd said that you were in love as you were writing that book, and I wondered if that had an effect on the writing of it.
Yeah, I think that had a huge effect on it, but it was all very much displaced. You know, I mean, there's not any echo of that in the book that an outsider could see, but I think it determines a lot of the feeling of the book and the sense there was that everything could come pouring out. I mean, that book was, in fact, somebody has done the work, not me, but I kept a diary during that time, and I didn't pass the diary on to Yvonne Smith, but I passed on to her all the entries for the days when I was writing the book, and she reconstructed the writing. And that book was written on 21 days. And during that time, which is one of the other things that perhaps was good and determines the book, during those 21 days, I marked 1,000 HSC English papers and 600 first-year poetry questions from Sydney University.
Wow. Here's an odd question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. Is writing anything like being in love?
I think that writing, when you're actually writing, you are always in a very heightened state. And you know yourself as a writer, when you sit down, and you need, if you're writing a novel, you need to do it every day. And it's a bit like training for a race or something like that. If you let one day go by, it's harder the next day. If you let 3 days go by, it's terrible. So you've got to do it every day. And what you're waiting for is for how long it takes you to fall into that state where you've forgotten that you're actually sitting at a desk and you are no longer aware of time, and some other kind of faculty has taken over in you, in which, as I say, everything about the state you're in is heightened. Emotion, memory, thought processes. And then you kind of have your run in that. It might be for an hour and a half or something. And then suddenly you're out of it again. You think, gosh, where did all that go? So I think there's something about the kind of heightened state of awareness and receptivity you're in.
In a sense, yeah. I love what you said about having to be with the novel all the time. Annie Dillard says, she says two things, well, she says many things, but one of the things she says is that you need to sit with the novel as if it were a patient, and you must sit with it all the time. Yeah. The other thing is, she said, you have to treat the novel as though it's a lion and you're the lion tamer. You have to go into the room and crack the whip continuously.
Yes. Look, I'm not sure about that part of it. I think one of the things about it is that the writing self, whatever that is, and I think it's a very selfish gene, that writing self has its own processes and makes its own demands. And actually, as you move further into the business of writing, you actually learn more quickly to fall into that state I was talking about, but you also learn not to speak before the novel speaks. You know, there's a piece of writing, it's the same thing happens with poetry, and that is that it knows where it's going. And you've got to, in some kind of way, not speak for it, because if you speak for it, you're shutting out its voice. And that's very, very important. Yeah. And it means that a lot that happens in the novel, it doesn't happen unconsciously, although there's an element of unconsciousness in it. But it has not only its own agenda, but its own logic, its own way of putting things together. And you've got to trust that. And learning to trust that is really what learning to be a writer is all about.
I think so. You've said that the poem knows something that the poet does not.
Yeah. And I think a novel does too. And the characters in a novel often decide to go their own way. And you talked about the great world. I mean, the great world was really something about, the subject of it in the end was history. And it was the difference between history as we read it in books, which is events and the people who are at the center of events. And then that other thing, which is the daily life of millions of people who really make up the untold story, the untold history of life on the planet. And it was the difference between history with a capital letter and history as it's lived. And so I created a couple of characters that I thought I was dealing with, and then I realized that they were of an age and in a place where they were bound to go off to the war, and they were bound to go off and become prisoners of the Japanese. And my first thought was, why are they doing that? What do I have to do now? Yeah. Because it really was a question of then having to enter an imaginative area that I had done no research about. And so characters in a book, and a book itself can take you absolutely somewhere that you don't yet know about, and that you really don't want to know about in it.
The Vic and Digger becoming prisoners it's impossible to imagine the great world without it.
Exactly, yeah.
And yet you didn't start knowing that's what you were going to do.
No.
I want to go on to talk more about some of the things I think I see in David's writing, which I might be wrong about, because the reader participates, obviously, in the reading and makes something of her own. But before we do, I just wondered, those HSC papers, what was the book that they were studying that you had to mark their comments on as you were writing An Imaginary Life. Can you remember?
I can't remember.
No.
But it would have been a general paper, you know, where they were perhaps doing an unseen poem or something like that. That's, I think, it would have been the first paper in the old HSC.
I was hoping I might find out that it was Hamlet, you know. And
No. No, the thing I would just say from what you just said, though, is I think because of what I'm talking about, the way the writer works, I sometimes get letters from, say, people who are studying a book, and they'll ask me a question, and I'll really write back and say to them, look, I can't answer this question, because if I give you an answer, you'll take it that the answer has come from the horse's mouth and it must be true. But in fact, the only person who has never read the book is the writer, because the writer there are things in the book that the writer can't see. So any really good reader knows infinitely more about the real structures and the real connections in a book than the writer probably does.
Yeah.
So the reader is the person that it's all for in the end,
Yeah.
and they're the only people who really finally get it.
Yeah. I'm going to give it a shot. Now, I've heard David spoken to very often about the idea of exile because of An Imaginary Life and because he lived away from Australia for a long time and because he writes about place. But I also understand that isn't necessarily a fertile idea for you. So I wanted to reframe it. I don't know if this is just my reading, but it does feel to me that all of your books, David, ask one essential question, and the question is, what is it to be? And all of them answer this question, it seems to me, by taking a man, removing him from his accustomed life and setting him down in another life to see what he'll do and notice about himself. So I think lately I've been thinking particularly of King Priam in Ransom, who leaves his court to go and fetch the body of his son, Hector, from Achilles, who's killed him. And in leaving his court, he decides that he must be a man and not a king. And so he gets aboard a cart, and he gets a carter called Somax to take him to Achilles and to the body of his son. And on the way, for the first time, he sits on the seat of a cart. He sits differently to the way that he's used to sitting. He eats griddle cakes that the carter's daughter-in-law has made for him. And for the very first time, because of the way the carter speaks, he understands that the food that he eats has ingredients, that it was made. Am I reading you properly when I notice that? You may not know, of course.
No, look, that was partly what I'd set up in that book was something a bit like a French classical play, to this extent that it was all moving towards the one point, which is when these two people who are essentially enemies, belong to different generations and all the rest of it, are going to meet. And so I thought that for that to actually work, we would need to know as much about those two characters as possible, so that when they came together, we would understand exactly the differences that were now about to be reconciled or not. And one of those things
between Priam and Achilles?
Between Priam and Achilles. And so then there was the journey that Priam was going to make. And then I found really that there was something that interested me a great deal. And that was this old man who has lived his whole life, but has always been the king, and he's lived absolutely as a king, cut off from every kind of reality. And suddenly he's set himself loose in the world for a day. And I was interested by the extent to which everything he now saw, like a very small child, was new to him. And that's what that passage was about. And it's a kind of a little pastoral scene, really, in the middle of the epic. It's partly the meeting again of two absolutely people from opposite ends of the world. And Priam suddenly discovers, at the age of 70 or whatever he is, that there's this world out there, which is a very, very interesting place, where things are happening. There are fish, there are birds, there are trees, there's water you can paddle in. And that seemed like a wonderful way of humanizing him, but in a half-comic kind of way. So it's a kind of comic interlude, but I wanted it to be, in its own way, moving as well, because these two old men actually have something to say to one another, and it's largely, on Priam's part, about a recognition of the richness of this man's life, different as it is from his own. But what they share, of course, is this sense of loss of their sons.
That's right.
So, and what Priam discovers, again, I really want to say, is something that I playfully was doing, and that is, there's a difference between classical notions of, say, theatre, as the French practice it, and that's an Aristotelian notion that only what is absolutely relevant belongs to the text, and the novel, as we all practice it, in which, as Nabokov says, the most wonderful thing in any novel are its wonderful irrelevancies. And there are these little moments in a novel which are not strictly relevant to character or plot or anything else, but in little moments like that, we are very, very close to the real truth of things, what it is to be, but what the world is. And so that is exactly what Priam discovers. He discovers, for example, that you can just babble on and talk, and that has its own interest
and pleasures,
and pleasure and its own justification, whereas he's used to a world where you never say anything unless you're making a public statement. So really that little chapter is also a kind of backhanded tribute to the novel and novel writing, and a lot of that book is about writing.
If you'll just all be quiet for a minute while I think about that. That's fascinating. I had thought of Priam putting his body against the world in a way that he never had before, and I thought of Ovid doing the same thing when he's in exile. I thought of the boys in Fly Away Peter having to put their bodies into the trenches, and I thought of Vic and Digger, and the way they are taken from home and forced to be new people in a different place. And I thought very much also when I was thinking of this idea about Jemmy Fairley in Remembering Babylon. Now he's an English boy of no home, and he's really sort of passed around from person to person in a way that seems unspeakably cruel to us now, but has its kindnesses as well, his life before he's shipwrecked. And he's taken in by Aboriginal people when he's 13, and then 16 years later in northern Queensland, he tries to rejoin white people, and he comes upon a house. And this is Jemmy, this is a section I'm going to ask David to read for you with this in mind. This to me seemed to be that kind of trying to bring yourself to a new place. So this is from Remembering Babylon, when Jemmy Fairley is trying to, in a sense, re-enter white life.
Yeah. I think all those things you're saying, Tegan, are absolutely right. There is that way in which people are tested in the books, and they have to find a new self, really, to respond to all of that. My interest in the Ransom episode doesn't go against that.
No, not at all. And I'm just storing it away. It's very interesting.
This is from Remembering Babylon. Further on, a woman emerged from a hut carrying a basket on her hip. She set it down and began pegging clothes on a line, shirts, then trousers, then children's things, and a frock. He fingered the rough material of the rag he had kept from the raft, which he wore knotted at his waist as a sign should he be caught, and had to sit in the grass hugging himself. Such a rush of bewilderment and soft affection came over him. He watched the woman hoist the line high by setting a forked pole under it, then pick up her basket and go. The soft things shifted in the breeze. Dripping sunlight, they made gestures this way and that, but awkwardly, weighed down by the shadows in their folds. The hem of a skirt lifted as if lively feet were in movement under it in a shuffling walk. Later, the same woman came out of her hut and stood making clucking sounds. Is this their language, he thought? He tried it very softly, putting his tongue to the roof of his mouth. Suddenly, in a spurt of dust, a mob of big birds shot into sight. All closely bunched and flapping their wings over one another's backs and squawking, they squabbled round the woman's skirt. She laughed, scooped a handful of something from the bowl she carried, tossed it into their midst, then went off again round the side of the hut. Keeping low to the ground, he scurried forward on all fours, scrabbling among the beaks and claws, and with the maddened birds flying at his arms and buffeting and pecking, scrambled for cover, then crammed the wet mass into his mouth. The taste of it, the strangeness, the familiarity dizzied him. The creature whose dreams he shared came right up to the surface of him. It fed on the saltiness of the stuff, and for a moment entirely took possession of him. He saw things through its eyes in bewildering flashes and found himself shaken with sobs. But where the tears came from so suddenly and why, he could not tell. A stranger, a child it might be, who had never wept, was weeping in him. He looked with wonder at his hands and at the remains of the pulpy mess, wiped it off, a little afraid now of its power, and out of habit muttered syllables that were a formula against bad magic, though he did not think the magic was bad. He went back to the line where the clothes, brighter now, were filled with sunlight and the lightness of breath. They moved about with vigour and were so lively, so emptily ghostly, that he felt a kind of dread at first of venturing in among them. The shirts made floppy gestures, shook their cuffs, launched out in a gust, and by instinct he ducked. The skirts stirred and swayed. It was like standing in the midst of a crowd that was never still. Now, where was that? Where? After a little, with the air ablaze on his shoulders and scents springing up where he trampled the grass, he began to move in and out among them, daring the stroke across his face as he let one soft thing, then another, brush against him, lifting his arms so that a watcher, seeing him pass from one side to the other of the line, dipping his head, might have thought it a kind of dance, a strange blackfellas dance among the washing. Imagine.
Thank you. That passage, those paragraphs to me seem to, I've spent the last few months having a wonderful time reading all of David's work, and that passage between two worlds seemed to me to be so significant in your work and such an interesting moment. Do you remember writing that particular passage, or
No.
not at all?
In fact, I must say that if you'd just given me that, I might not even have recognised it. I mean, that comes about from the fact that you very, very seldom read a book again after you've let it go. And I mean, I think the letting it go is really, really important. And the last time you read the book often is when you're doing proofs, which is so painful that you don't want to do it ever again.
But you do, when you're writing it, you do run the sentences through your mind almost like beads against your teeth or something like that. There's a sort of, you are turning those words over in your head a lot, aren't you, as you're writing them?
Yes, and I think that, I mean, I'm always very careful about the music of the thing. I mean, that's as important to me almost as anything else. And almost everything I write, I think, is meant to be read aloud. And that's why I say I write for slow readers, because if you're going to read it aloud, you read slowly.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, which a lot of that, as you see there, is very visual. And I think that, almost all the books have been taken up at one time or another by somebody who thinks they would make a good film. And, you keep wanting to say to these people, I can't imagine how somebody who's a professional filmmaker doesn't see that, visual as these books are, line by line and paragraph by paragraph, they are all actually so interior that you can't translate that to the screen. I mean, there's almost nothing happens in these books except in someone's head.
There's a lot of them for sale outside if you... The other thing also, excuse me while I fiddle with this, is that they are books.
Yeah.
And that is why they were written as books.
Yeah, well, I think that from the time I began to write novels, I felt I was really writing against what is the strongest kind of tradition here. And that is, until I think Patrick White came along, but as I recently discovered, a very early book written in the late 30s, Kenneth Mackenzie's The Young Desire, it is also like that. Interiorization is not one of the subjects or the stances that Australian writers in fiction had mostly taken. The books are very largely books of action, and they're books about open exterior living in a kind of way, a kind of novel which is essentially about what's going on in someone's head or inside their body, was not really the staple of Australian fiction. But that was the kind of book I wanted to write, and the kind of book I've always written, and a book which has actually found readers who perhaps wanted that kind of book, but which were not really getting it.
When you and I were talking earlier about Australian fiction, in fact, and you were talking about what you called a sort of a thread or a line of Australian books that were important to you. And we were discussing whether or not they were about place, because that's one of the things that your work is often talked of in terms of. Can you tell the audience what those books were and what's important about them to you?
One of my favourite Australian novels would be Morris Guest, a very, very strange book by Henry Handel Richardson. That's set in Leipzig. It has the word Australia never occurs in it. It's about a young woman who, it's a very strange book too, because it's not like an English book, it's not like an Australian book, it's not even like a French book. What it is like is one of those German books that were being written at the same time, because it's largely about all the forms of sexual obsession and deviation you can possibly think of, but very, very interiorized and very different, from the book of hers, which most people read, which is The Fortunes of Richard Marnie. And then, another book that I, again, think is one of the great, great books by an Australian is Frederick Manning's book, which is sometimes called Her Private Suite and sometimes called The Middle Parts of Fortune. And that's set in the Battle of the Somme, essentially, but a lot of it behind the lines. Again, none of the characters in that are Australian. But both those writers are Australian writers, and their Australianness is absolutely to be taken for granted. They just happen not to write. And then, there's a book that is by an Australian, as I said, the Kenneth Mackenzie book, The Young Desire It, which came out in 1937. And then the next book, it seems to me, in that line would be something like Patrick White's The Aunt's Story. And really, it's Patrick White who takes it for granted that a novel is largely an interior narrative rather than a narrative of action.
And so, coming to the idea of place, which is what we were talking about, and the sort of notion of Australianness, I want to focus right in on the idea of place. Tim Winton once said that he has never left. He is where he always was. And so he observes his place again and again every single day, like somebody rereading a favourite book. But you've left. Can you imagine what it might be like to still be in Brisbane?
No, look, I don't think I ever left. I don't think you ever, as a writer, leave the first place you know. And, you know, that place, its particular light, the feel of its atmosphere on your skin, the kind of weather it has, the sound of things like rain on a tin roof. In my case, growing up in one of those wooden Queenslander houses with space underneath that you also lived in and that children used to explore. That is the world that first utterly shaped my sensibility. And it's also the world that I first learned to map and explore. And I think that you never grow out of that original map of what domestic reality or space or light is. So it doesn't matter where you go, that place remains, and I've said this also, absolutely the most exotic place you will ever come across, because you are always seeing it through the eyes of a child who is trying to work out all the time what is actually going on, what reality is, where he is in the world. And I suppose one of the things about going back to the things you brought up before is one of the things that happens always to people in my books is they always find that they are back somewhere trying to see things the way they saw them as a child. Because that's the first place where you're ever made aware of the mystery of the world, but also the unpredictability of people, the difficulty of knowing why things are happening, why people are saying what they're saying. And I think again, going back again to childhood, I'm fascinated by the extent to which people who are going to be writers start practicing all they will need for their art at the age of about 3. And that is, what they're doing is looking around with little eyes that are never faced with what is familiar, because nothing that is familiar is as it really is, and who are endlessly eavesdropping and are learning all the sort of wiles of lingering in a room a little bit longer than you should be, standing behind a half-open door. Little writers, at a very, very early age, are practicing what writers will do for the rest of their lives, which is eavesdrop, question, all of that.
Eavesdropping, I think, is a very, very important part of it. I think also there's something in understanding, going on as a writer to understand what you understand as a child, that there are two realities. And one of the things that comes to me is that in my grandparents' house there were a couple of spiral staircases, and one of them was sort of like a tunnel, and in the tunnel was a little door that led to under the house, and my grandfather on the way down this tunnel of stairs used to put his face through the door and say, "G'day, John, how are you?" and then close the door again, as if whoever it was who was in there could get out. And I believed him at the same time as not believing him.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things of being a writer as well, isn't it? Sort of being aware that things can exist on two planes. Like that.
Yes. Look, I think that these little people who are going to be writers, I don't know what other children believe, but I think other children grow out of it in a kind of way, and writers never do. And it is always listening to what people are saying, for example, as you do with a child like your mother, and you say, why is she saying that? I know she doesn't think that. That's not true.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
it is that mystery about why adults behave the way they do. I mean, society and the interchange between people is absolutely fascinating to you as a small child. It is the great mystery. And remains so. Writers are people who've never really got any of the answers to any of the questions.
Writers are people who are still seeing the slippage between that public expression and the private self. How interesting. I need to keep an eye on the time because I need to leave time for you, but there's so much I want to ask. I'm going to ask this very quickly. Recently, I've been teaching a course in Australian literature, and David and I share a real passion for teaching. And one of the things that we spoke about was that one of the ways to teach literature to young people was simply to read it to them. Not to tell them about it, but to read it to them. And I wondered, if you had such a strange task, how you might go about teaching your own work to young people.
Oh, that's very difficult to say. I think faced with any group of people, especially young people, who are wary of what they think is difficult, absolutely the simplest thing to do is read to them. This is always true of poetry. You know, if you actually read a poem to someone, they will hear things immediately that they would find it very difficult to distinguish on a page. And when I was growing up in my days at school, we learned almost every poem we came across by heart. And that's the only way I know in which you can get the music of poetry completely into your head, and then discover that with the music comes more of the meaning than you thought you could grasp. So I would read it aloud. And I remember when I was teaching in Birkenhead in England, I was teaching 14-year-olds, and the set book for their equivalent of the junior HSC was Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And these are 14-year-old boys in the north of England. And
lucky them, is all I can say.
And I thought the only thing I can do is read it to them. Because if I read it to them, they will hear the jokes, they'll hear the ironies, which they won't be able to read themselves off the page. And the result was that they would roar with laughter. And that became and that is a very, very difficult book for anybody. I mean, if you're going to even do a Jane Austen novel, Northanger Abbey is not the one you would decide to start with.
It is tricky to teach, and I had real trouble getting students to read that one at all. They had to come to class having read it, and I was horrified to find how many of them had simply given up.
One of the things they loved about it was that often what the narrator says there is, and it's about a girl who's been reading a lot of Gothic novels, and she's decided when she goes and visits some people that she's in a Gothic novel, and that they're all characters out of a Gothic novel. But what Jane Austen keeps saying, or she keeps saying, is, well, I can believe that these things might be like this somewhere remote, like the north of England, but not here. And of course, the kids would think that was fabulous.
Listen, it is time for you to ask questions if you would like to, and we have microphones at either side of the stairs. While you gather up your courage to ask David a question, I'm going to ask him a very quick one, which I know the answer to, but I love his answer. Which is your favourite Austen?
My favourite Austen? Probably Persuasion. The first one I ever read, the year in which I was 12, and it was between leaving state school and going to grammar school, I read a whole lot of books that absolutely changed my life. And they were Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Vanity Fair, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Pride and Prejudice. Not what you expect a 12-year-old boy to read, but you'd be surprised what actually people read. And so you'd be surprised what you got from them. And what I got from those, because at school we had done as a set book, We of the Never Never, which I thought was the most boring book I had ever read in my life. I could not care less about any of those characters. And the Northern Territory seemed like the bottom of the world as far as the furthest distance from where I was in Brisbane. The thing about all of those other books was they kept telling me the most extraordinary things about the world, and I couldn't wait to grow up to get into it. I mean, life was so much more interesting than anybody had let on.
So I think we do have a question here. Somebody at the microphone? No, there's not. Well, got you. We'll just get one from down here first, and then one from up there.
Could you tell us a little more about Ransom as a book about writing?
Yeah. Look, I've always been very interested in storytelling itself. And it seems to me that if you go right back to the beginning, in a darkened hall in the middle of the night where people were taking shelter, somebody was always there to tell people a story. And that's much like the way you get told stories by your mother or read to by your mother, or the way we, certainly as kids, told stories to one another. As soon as we were sort of sent to bed, we would sort of sit up in bed and tell stories to one another. There's something absolutely magical about hearing a story told. And it's very, very important to us in some kind of way. It's very liberating for us to be invited to move out of our own skin into some other skin, which may be a place that's more dangerous or more mysterious or whatever. But we need to do that. And we also need that escape from time that allows you to have those formulae like once upon a time and ever after. That kind of frees us from time. So I was interested in this book to go back to the very first story that is ever told and written down. And we forget that the Iliad was written or composed 27 centuries ago and is still, perhaps, for my money, the greatest piece of writing ever offered to us. And we can enter into that kind of storytelling that it represents. So I wanted to be a storyteller of that kind, but also I wanted to raise the whole question of what storytelling is and what it does for you. And in the book, Priam is fascinated by the stories that Somax has to tell him, and then we're left at the very end of the book with Somax telling a story that no one believes, although we've just read it.
I found that very hard, that no one believed him.
But it doesn't matter in the end whether you believe the story. What is important is that you go along with the story, that you enter the story, that you let it happen to you, and you let happen to you whatever is that it is, that strange lightening of the burden of being or something that getting lost in a story offers us.
Thank you. We have a question up here.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to something that you said about that you felt it was important to let a book go. And I was wondering how you do that and whether it's more difficult for some books than others.
That's a very interesting question because when you're actually writing the book, that's the place you go every day, where you're entirely in control, or not, but where you know when the day starts and you've had breakfast and all the rest of it, that's where you're going to be quite safely, absolutely on your own, with no one watching, for a certain number of hours, and in the company of people you've chosen to bring into existence because their problems or their fate or their charm or whatever it is something you want to spend time with. But then you know that you're going to get to the end of it, rather as you know that you're going to get to the end of it when you read a book. And you have then to say, okay, these people have had enough of me. I've got to let them go, but I've also got to let the book go. And that's a great moment because you know you're going to be, however pleasant or great it's been to be in there, you're going to come out of that world and you're going to have the chance to go into another one. And it's also important to let the book go because at that point you've really got to say to yourself, this book belongs to the people that it was always actually intended for, which is readers. And this book has got to go out and find its own friends. And it's a bit like letting a child grow up and go. And then you're bereft for a while and thinking maybe I won't have another idea, or I'll never write another book, or what on earth am I going to do today? Perhaps I should go and do a bit of shopping at Broadway. But eventually, quite quickly usually, some other character or some other overheard thing or little story you've heard kind of grabs at you, and you say, I wonder what that's about. I wonder why I can't let this go. And before you know it, you're following it and you're off on another book.
You're off again. And a question over here?
Thank you for all your poems and books, David. You've told us a little bit about you and Jane Austen at 12, and this is a bit of a silly and mean question and too big for a session, but could you tell us about you and Shakespeare?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I said that probably the Iliad is the greatest single piece of writing there ever was. And how extraordinary, right at the beginning of our culture, for somebody to just throw that down and say, okay, there it is, match that, and no one ever has. The thing about Shakespeare is he is undoubtedly the greatest writer, and I would think perhaps the greatest kind of being in any of the arts. I mean, he is just so protean. I mean, there's just no way in which you can ever come to the end of him. So when I said that about the Iliad, perhaps there is no single work of Shakespeare's that is as great as the Iliad, but there's also nothing as extraordinary to find your way into than that mind of Shakespeare's. I started reading Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare when I was probably about 8. And by the time I was 10, my father had bought me a little 12-volume complete Shakespeare, which I still have. And I'd started working my way through those plays then. And I couldn't say how many times I've read each one of those plays. I mean, it would be hundreds and hundreds of times. And I still never get to the end of it. I love it when I go to see a Shakespeare play and suddenly something that happens there throws a line up that I've never kind of noticed before. And you think, oh, how wonderful. This man is kind of unbelievable. And it's very, very hard as a writer, knowing how writers work, to imagine what that mind is. Just extraordinary. I mean, it's great to have something offered to you that absolutely exceeds your imagination.
There's a wonderful moment in one of Harold Bloom's books where he identifies what he calls the chagrin of thinking that you've had an original thought and then you realise it was Shakespeare's. We've got time for just one more question, just over here.
David, thank you for your wonderful body of work. I'm very interested in your comment that your work is meant to be read aloud, and I think that's the poet in you. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about poetry and the novel and how they interact.
Poetry and a novel are very, very different from one another in as much as you know, when you're writing them, you write in a very different way. I mean, the thing about the novel is, as I say, it's this big thing, and you go back to it each day, and you add a little bit. And the miraculous thing about that is, although you're only sort of going an inch at a time, somehow a perfect arc and a perfect architecture is creating itself without your knowing how it's coming into being. Poetry is very different, and the great joy of poetry is that it comes in a rush. And usually, I think most poets would tell you that a first draft of a poem might take a quarter of an hour, half an hour. And it's there, and you may have to work on that for a very long time to perfect it, but it's the intensity of that is the attraction. And the intensity is partly that the language is much more dense, and the connections between things are much more electric, and there's a kind of logic there which is not the logic that you normally use in writing fiction. I don't make a distinction other than that distinction between the two forms. And I think that when I talked about the novel before, I think I learned to write a novel by doing in the novel what I normally do with a poem. So that in novels of mine, the connections between things are pretty much of the same associative kind that they would be in a poem. And that's what makes them interiorized as they are, is the connections are neither chronological nor logical so much as metaphorical or associative or whatever. And essentially what you want to say is that if you're a writer, that whatever form you're working in, it's the same sensibility and the same temperament that is there. So the form doesn't really matter.
But thank you so much for that question, because there's so much that's interesting to talk about in David's body of work that we hadn't quite got there. And I thought we might finish by asking David to read a poem from his new collection. I've chosen one, but do feel free to change my choice if you'd like to read something else.
This is called Night Poem. The night poem writes itself in the long middle watch, turns up on a notepad on the night table, sight of happy collisions, stones at a cracking pace that skip, skip, skip to take the shine off glassy mornings. A shot at the sorrowful exactitudes, where if and if only are shifts in a plot, some of them real disasters. The night poem, like the night, has a habit of slipping away, of creeping back under a stone in the boneyard, into a mouth whose silence is a black joke, a deadpan tale told among drifters on the high plains of sleep. A leaf, a leaflet, blown in at dawn out of border country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and I think the person I really need to thank is Mr. Malouf, because I do this job a bit and it's not always easy, because not everybody finds it easy to do, but David's enormous generosity, not just towards younger writers and towards all sorts of people who love the Australian arts, but just to me right now, I'm very grateful for. So let's thank him again.